Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells. I'm Arthur Hastings, your faithful companion on yet another expedition into the shadowed corners of human nature. Allow me to express our deepest gratitude to our devoted listeners across the globe. If this is your maiden voyage with us, do consider subscribing and leaving a comment telling us from which corner of the world you listen. 3 cities, 3 victims, and at each scene, left with almost ceremonial care, a single white camellia, its stem cut with the precision of a surgeon's blade. This is The Woman Who Knew Too Little, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Lower your lights, pour yourself a calming tisane in the manner of Poirot himself, and ready those little grey cells of yours. Chapter 1. The Calm That Lies. Life, declared Hercule Poirot to no one in particular, is a matter of precision. The waiter, a young man of 19 with a fine head of dark hair, and a commendable ability to conceal his opinion of difficult guests, set down a second cup of coffee and retired without comment. He had already been instructed at considerable length on the proper timing of a soft-boiled egg. He required no further education this morning. Poirot surveyed the café table with the satisfaction of a general reviewing a parade. The egg stood upright in its cup, its top removed with surgical neatness. The coffee was precisely the temperature he preferred. Hot enough to be taken seriously, cool enough not to insult the palate. The croissant described a curve of almost mathematical perfection. He permitted himself a small smile. San Aurelio lay before him like a postcard composed by an artist of uncommon talent. It was, there was no more exact word, glittering. The harbour below the café terrace was turquoise, then cobalt, then a dark and fathomless blue at its farthest edge. Fishing boats rocked gently in the morning light, their painted hulls reflected in water so clear one might read the depths like a text. The white stone terraces of the town rose behind him in ascending tiers, each one fragrant with lemon trees and bright with geraniums in terracotta pots. Church bells spoke to one another across the hillside. Vendors cried their wares in the market below. Somewhere a child laughed. It was, in short, the sort of place where nothing disagreeable could possibly occur. Poirot had learned in the course of a long and productive career to distrust precisely such places. He had come to San Aurelio for what he described, in his letter to his faithful Miss Lemon, as a modest holiday devoted entirely to the restoration of psychological symmetry. Miss Lemon had responded, in her customary efficient manner, with a typed itinerary, the address of a reputable pharmacist, and a note to the effect that his correspondence would be forwarded twice weekly. She had not inquired what psychological symmetry was, nor had she expressed any doubt that it would be successfully restored. Miss Lemon's faith in Poirot was, if anything, even more unshakable than his faith in himself. He had been in San Aurelio for 4 days. He had walked by the harbour in the mornings, rested in the afternoons, and spent his evenings on the terrace of the Albergo del Porto. It's where the proprietor, a charming and attentive man named Marco Bellini, ensured that his wine was chilled to perfection and that the other guests did not attempt to converse with him. Poirot had tipped generously. The arrangement had proved satisfactory. This morning, however, something had pricked at his attention. The market below the café terrace was in full voice. Scarlet tomatoes glistened beside silver fish, packed in ice. Olive oil shone like liquid gold in glass bottles, arrayed along a wooden counter. The air was full of cheerful argument, the flapping of striped awnings, the cry of gulls. It was, in every visible particular, a scene of domestic abundance and uncomplicated life. And yet, Poirot's gaze had come to rest with that peculiar quality of attention which he himself called le sentiment d'imperfection, the feeling of something not quite right, upon a figure at the far end of the market. A man stood beside a stall of dried herbs, apparently absorbed in examining a bundle of rosemary. He had been standing there without purchasing anything for the better part of 20 minutes. The newspaper he carried was folded under his arm. It was, Poirot noted, dated 3 days ago. A man who reads yesterday's newspaper is forgetful or careless. A man who reads a newspaper 3 days old is doing something else entirely. The man was tall, fair, dressed with the easy elegance of the English gentleman abroad. Linen jacket, pale trousers, brown brogues polished to a mirror. He was perhaps 40, with the lean, slightly weathered look of a man who spent time outdoors on purpose rather than by accident. He had the air of one waiting for something, waiting, moreover, with practiced patience. Poirot had noted him at the hotel as well. Adrian Vale, Mr., British, occupation given in the register as art dealer. He had arrived 6 days ago, 2 days before Poirot himself. He had no visitors, no apparent business, and no artworks. Poirot turned his attention back to his croissant. It was at this precise moment that a woman sat down across from him. She appeared from nowhere, or rather, from the direction of the harbour steps, and where the morning crowd was thickest, and dropped into the chair opposite with the abruptness of someone who has made a decision just slightly faster than their nerves can follow. She was in her middle 30s with dark hair loosened by the sea wind and a pallor that sat oddly on a face evidently accustomed to more colour. Her cotton dress was blue, simply cut. Her shoes, sensible, low-heeled, were dusty from the cobblestones. She was breathing quickly. She placed both hands flat on the table as though steadying herself against the world, and looked directly at him. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I need help." Poirot set down his coffee cup. He was, he would later reflect, not entirely surprised. He had been on holiday for precisely 4 days. Experience suggested this was approximately 3 days longer than circumstances generally permitted. "You know my name, madame," he said. "I asked at the hotel." She did not apologize. "I have been looking for you since yesterday evening." "And why did you not come to me yesterday evening?" A slight hesitation. "I wasn't sure. I hoped that I was imagining it." Imagining what, precisely? She drew a breath. Her eyes, which were grey and intelligent, moved briefly to the market below, then back to his face. "Someone is trying to kill me," she said. Then, as though she found the certainty insufficient, she added, "I think." Poirot regarded her carefully, and the hands on the table were steady now. The voice, though low, was controlled. This was not a woman given to hysteria. Whatever had driven her to his café table this morning had, he judged, cost her something considerable in pride. "You think," he repeated. "You are not certain." "No." She met his gaze without flinching. "That is precisely the difficulty." "Tell me, then, why you think so." Again that pause, longer this time. Not, he thought, the pause of a woman constructing a falsehood, but of a woman confronting something she had not yet found adequate words for. When she spoke, her voice was careful, deliberate, as though she were reading from a text she only partly understood. "Because everyone keeps telling me I've forgotten something," she said, "but I don't know what it is." Poirot was quiet for a moment. The gulls cried overhead. The market continued its cheerful commerce below them. The bells of the church higher on the hillside rang the half-hour. He opened his mouth to speak. The woman's gaze moved past his shoulder. The change in her face was instantaneous and absolute. Colour draining, eyes widening, a stillness that was worse in its way than any cry. She stood. Without a word, without a backward glance, she walked quickly from the café terrace, descended the 3 steps to the cobbled street, and was absorbed into the crowd of the morning market as completely as a stone dropped into water. Poirot turned. At the far end of the terrace, a man had paused beside the iron railing that overlooked the harbour. He was looking out to sea. His face in profile was pleasant and unremarkable. He lingered perhaps 5 seconds, then walked unhurriedly away. It was Marco Bellini, the proprietor of the Albergo del Porto, the charming and attentive Mr. Bellini, who ensured that one's wine was chilled and that one's peace was undisturbed. Poirot sat for a long moment, his coffee growing cold at his elbow. Then he summoned the waiter, paid his bill with characteristic exactness, and descended the steps into the market. He did not find Lydia Gray. For that, he learned later that afternoon from the hotel register, was the woman's name, until the following day, by which time the matter had altered considerably. Her name was Lydia Gray. She was listed in the hotel register as a tourist, recently arrived, and beside her name in a hand that was not hers, someone had written a single word. He then crossed it out with such force that the pen had scored the page. The word, though crossed out, was still quite legible. It was remember. Chapter 2. The Pieces Already Moving. The Albergo del Porto occupied a position of some distinction at the harbour's edge. Not the grandest establishment in San Aurelio, but possessed of a quiet self-assurance that Poirot found more agreeable than grandeur. Its whitewashed walls were thick enough to hold the morning cool well into the afternoon. Its terrace gave directly onto the water. The rooms were high-ceilinged, the linen immaculate, and the breakfast served with a punctuality that Poirot considered the surest indicator of civilized management. He had revised this opinion somewhat upon learning the name beside the scored word in the register. He had not, in the event, drawn the matter to anyone's attention. He had studied the entry for perhaps 10 seconds, long enough to commit it entirely to that formidable memory, and then continued his conversation with the young woman at the desk about the availability of a second pillow. She had not noticed his pause. People rarely did. That evening Poirot dined alone on the terrace, as was his custom, and observed. The hotel held at present 11 guests. Of these, 4 interested him. And Adrian Vale sat at the corner table with a bottle of local white wine and a book he did not read. He turned a page every 8 or 9 minutes with the regularity of a man performing a duty rather than seeking pleasure. He had spoken to no one at dinner, but Poirot had observed him earlier near the harbour steps, in what appeared to be a brief and unremarkable exchange with one of the fishing boat operators. Brief, unremarkable, and conducted in fluent Italian that sat rather too comfortably in the mouth of an English art dealer with no apparent business in the town. At the centre table, a woman dined with the composed efficiency of someone accustomed to eating alone in professional circumstances. She was perhaps 45, dark-haired, with the kind of face that communicated intelligence before it communicated anything warmer. Her posture was exact. She had ordered from the menu in the manner of one assessing a specimen, not unkindly, but with a detachment that was habitual rather than deliberate. Dr. Sophia Marine, according to the register, neurologist, from Milan, arrived 9 days ago, which placed her arrival 4 days before Lydia Gray, and 5 before Poirot himself. Marco Bellini moved between the tables with the practiced ease of the born host. A word here, a gesture there, a laugh deployed at precisely the correct moment. He was perhaps 50, silver at the temples, with dark eyes that were warm and watchful in equal measure. One noticed the warmth first. Poirot had made a professional habit of noticing what came second. And then there was Lydia Gray, who did not dine at all. Her table stood empty. Poirot had inquired with the mildest of manner whether Signorina Gray was expected. The waiter had conveyed through a small shrug of operatic eloquence that the Signorina had requested a tray in her room. The waiter had not been surprised. The waiter, Poirot inferred, had conveyed trays to her room before. After dinner, Poirot took a turn along the harbour wall in the blue dusk. San Aurelio was smaller at night. The hills that rose above the town shed their daytime quality of picturesque backdrop and became something more substantial. Dark shapes against a darker sky, enclosing the harbour and its lights with a firmness that might, in a different mood, be called oppressive. The alleyways that branched from the harbour front were narrow enough to touch on both sides with outstretched arms. Cats moved silently along the walls. The smell of the sea was stronger after sunset, salt and something deeper, older. It was on the third alley from the harbour steps that Poirot encountered, and was encountered by Inspector Carlo Ventresca. The inspector was a compact man of 52, with a grey moustache considerably less magnificent than Poirot's own, and the permanent expression of a man who has found the world only moderately amusing. He wore his authority with the ease of long habit. He had the look, Poirot thought, of a man who solved most of his problems by waiting for them to resolve themselves, and who had been moderately successful by this method. Monsieur Poirot." The inspector's tone combined wariness with a reluctant respect that he had clearly not intended to display quite so promptly. "I had heard you were in San Aurelio." "The news travelled quickly," said Poirot pleasantly. "In San Aurelio, all news travels quickly." Ventresca fell into step beside him. It was not precisely an invitation, but neither was it an intrusion. It was, Poirot recognized, an assessment. "You are on holiday." "I was on holiday," Poirot agreed. "The distinction is a fine one, but I find it grows finer with each passing hour." A pause. The harbour lights trembled on the water. "You spoke this morning with a woman at the cafe above the market," said Ventresca. "Lydia Gray." "I did." Poirot glanced at him sideways. "You are well informed, Inspector." "I told you, San Aurelio is small." Another pause, longer than the first. "What did she want?" "She sat at my table uninvited for perhaps 4 minutes," said Poirot. "She told me she believed someone wished her harm. Before she could say anything further, she saw something that alarmed her and left." He allowed a beat of silence. You are asking me this question, Inspector, which suggests that you already have some interest in Signorina Gray, and that her conversation with me has not improved your peace of mind. Ventresca was quiet for a moment. Then, each with the air of a man making a concession he has already decided is necessary. She came to my office 3 days ago. She said she had been followed. I asked her from where and by whom and when. She could not answer any of these questions to my satisfaction. A pause waited with professional frustration. She said she had been losing days, waking up without knowing where she had been. Her manner is difficult to assess. Because she appears uncertain, said Poirot. And uncertainty, in your experience, belongs to the unreliable witness. Ventresca neither confirmed nor denied this. She is not unreliable, said Poirot quietly, and with sufficient certainty that the inspector glanced at him. She is frightened. There is a considerable difference. The frightened person omits and hesitates. The unreliable person elaborates. He paused. Signorina Gray does not elaborate. They had reached the end of the harbour wall. Below them, the sea moved in long, the slow swells against the stone. The lighthouse at the point sent its beam across the water in steady, patient revolution. I will tell you one thing more, said Poirot, and then I think we shall both sleep better for having said it. There is a guest at the Albergo del Porto, a Dr. Sophia Marine, who arrived in San Aurelio 9 days ago. There is another guest, an art dealer named Viley, who arrived 6 days ago. Signorina Gray arrived 5 days ago. He tilted his head slightly, not in that characteristic gesture that Ventresca would come to know well in the days that followed. I find the sequence of their arrivals of interest. You may find it so as well. Ventresca looked at him steadily. You have been here 4 days. I have, said Poirot, and I assure you my arrival was entirely my own idea. Though I confess... He straightened his cuffs against the sea air, a small, unprecise gesture. I am no longer entirely certain that is a point in my favour. He bid the inspector good night and walked back along the harbour front. In his room he sat for some time at the writing table with a sheet of the hotel's cream notepaper before him. On it he wrote 3 names, the dates of their arrivals, and between them a series of small connecting lines. He studied this arrangement for several minutes with the focused stillness of a man who has heard a piece of music played incorrectly and is determining precisely which note is wrong. Then he drew a 4th name, his own, and connected it to nothing. Not yet. He was still considering this when, from somewhere below his window, there came the sound of footsteps on the harbour cobbles, quick, light, unmistakably purposeful, at an hour when the harbour was otherwise silent. He went to the window. The figure crossing the square below was slight, dark-coated, and moving with the directness of someone who knew exactly where they were going. He could not see the face, but he could see, held loosely at the figure's side, a single pale flower, white in the lamplight, perfectly fresh. Poirot watched until the figure was gone. Then he returned to his table and wrote, beneath the 4 names, a single word, camellia. He underlined it once, each with characteristic precision, and went to bed. Chapter 3. The Crime That Is Also a Message. The stone staircase that descended from the Via del Faro to the harbour lighthouse was not, in the ordinary way of things, a place that invited attention. It was steep, narrow and shaded for most of the day by the cliff face above it. The sort of utilitarian passage that exists in every Mediterranean town and is noticed only by those who have reason to use it. Fishermen used it before dawn, and children used it in the afternoons against all parental instruction. At night, it was empty. It was at the foot of these stairs at 7:20 on a Tuesday morning that a boy delivering bread to the lighthouse keeper found Lydia Gray. She was alive. This was the first thing the boy established by the simple method of shouting at her until she moved. She was unconscious, her right temple darkened with bruising, while her left ankle turned beneath her at an angle that suggested the fall had not been a gentle one. She lay on the lowest step as though the staircase itself had deposited her there as an afterthought. The bread boy ran for the police. The police sent for the doctor. The doctor, not Dr. Marat, but the town physician, a solid and sensible man named Ferraro, sent, with some hesitation, for Poirot. The hesitation Poirot understood upon arrival was Inspector Ventresca's. "She is alive," said Ventresca by way of greeting. He was standing at the foot of the stairs with his hands clasped behind his back and the expression of a man who had hoped, on rising that morning, for an unremarkable day. Concussion, a badly sprained ankle. Dr. Ferraro says she will recover. "That is the good news," said Poirot. "You would not have sent for me if there were only good news." Ventresca said nothing. He simply stepped aside. At the top of the staircase, some 40 steps above, where the path levelled into the small clearing before the lighthouse gate, a pair of shoes stood side by side on the stone. They were the shoes Poirot had noted on Lydia Gray at the cafe. Low-heeled, sensible, dusty from the cobblestones. They had been placed with a neatness that was wholly at odds with the violence of what had followed. Heels together, toes pointing outward, as though their owner had simply stepped out of them before descending to the sea. Poirot climbed the stairs without haste, pausing twice to examine the stone. At the 14th step, there was a faint, dark smear along the wall. Too high for a stumbling hand, too deliberate in its arc. At the 22nd step, a chip of fresh stone, pale against the weathered surface where something hard had struck it recently. He noted both without touching either, and at the top, he crouched beside the shoes for a long moment. Beside the left shoe, half sheltered by a crack in the stone, lay a flower. It was a white camellia. Its petals were unmarked. It was, impossibly, perfectly fresh in the salt air of an early morning. Someone had placed it there with care. Not dropped, not discarded, but positioned with the same quiet deliberateness as the shoes themselves. Poirot did not touch it. He looked at it for some time, his head tilted slightly, as his expression unreadable. Then he looked at the stem. It had been cut, not broken, not torn, cut cleanly at a precise angle by something considerably sharper than a penknife. He descended the stairs and reported his observations to Ventresca with characteristic economy. "Placed," said Ventresca flatly. "You are telling me someone placed the flower there." "Someone with a steady hand and a surgical instrument," said Poirot. "Yes." A silence fell between them. Below, the harbour went about its morning commerce with cheerful indifference. "She has no memory of coming here," said Ventresca at last. "She cannot say when or why or how the fall occurred. Ferraro says this may be the concussion." He paused. "Or it may be something else. Did she say anything when she regained consciousness?" Two things. Ventresca produced a small notebook and consulted it, though Poirot suspected he had no need to. She asked where she was. And then she said, he read carefully, "I don't remember the stairs." He closed the notebook, not, "I don't remember falling." She said she did not remember the stairs. Poirot received this information with the stillness that Ventresca was beginning to recognize as the outward expression of rapid internal motion. "I should like to speak with her," said Poirot. "Ferraro has sedated her. This afternoon, perhaps." It was not until 2 o'clock that Poirot sat beside Lydia Gray's bed in the small room on the second floor of the Albergo del Porto. The bruising at her temple had deepened to purple. Her ankle was bound. She looked against the white pillow, simultaneously younger and older than she had at the cafe, the animation gone, leaving only the structure of the face, which was fine-boned and, in repose, rather sad. She opened her eyes and looked at him without surprise. "You are the man from the cafe," she said. "I am Hercule Poirot," he said. "We spoke yesterday morning for several minutes about a matter that concerned you." She studied him. He watched her search for the memory and find, in its place, only absence. The experience was evidently not unfamiliar to her. She accepted it with a composure that cost her something, but she accepted it. "I don't remember," she said. "I'm sorry." "There is nothing to apologize for, mademoiselle. Do you remember coming to San Aurelio?" "Yes." A pause. "I think so. I remember the ferry from Genoa. I remember my room." Her gaze moved to the window. "I remember that someone told me to come here." "Someone told you?" "A letter." A slight furrow between her brows. It said the truth I had forgotten was waiting here." "And did you know who sent it?" "No." Then quietly, "No, but I came anyway. That tells you something about the state I was in, I expect." It told Poirot several things, none of which he shared at present. "Mademoiselle Gray," he said after a moment, "I am going to ask you a question that may seem strange, and I would ask you to consider it carefully before answering. In the weeks before you came here, in Genoa perhaps, or before that, did you attend any professional conference, any medical or scientific gathering?" Something shifted in her face. Not memory, precisely. More like the shadow that memory casts when it cannot itself appear. "I used to work," she said slowly, "for a pharmaceutical company. I left some time ago. There were conferences. I attended them." She stopped. "I can't remember the details." "The company's name?" A long pause. "Veritas," she said at last, and then looked briefly startled, as though the word had surfaced without her assistance. Poirot noted the name with the care he gave to all such involuntary offerings. He said only, "You have been most helpful, mademoiselle. I shall not tire you further." He was at the door when she spoke again. "Monsieur Poirot." He turned. She was watching him with those steady grey eyes, and in them was something that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but partook of both. "Yesterday at the cafe, whatever I said to you, was I right to be afraid?" Poirot considered the shoes placed neatly at the top of the stairs. He considered the camellia cut with a surgeon's precision. He considered the words scored through the hotel register, and the figure crossing the dark harbour with a pale flower, and a sequence of arrivals that was not coincidence. "Yes," he said. He saw no merit in deceiving her. "But you are less alone in San Aurelio than you were this morning." He left her to her rest and went directly to find Ventresca. There was, he had decided, no more time for the pleasures of observation. In the performance, for performance it was, had already moved through 2 of its acts. The flower at the lighthouse was not a signature. It was an announcement. The 3rd act was imminent. Chapter 4. The Game announces itself. The sitting room that Marco Bellini placed at Poirot's disposal was a small, square room at the rear of the hotel, overlooking a courtyard where a lemon tree grew in a terracotta pot of impressive age. It had, de Bellini explained with the apologetic charm of a man who knows the offering is adequate but not exceptional, the advantage of privacy. The other guests did not pass through it. The staff used a separate corridor. Poirot thanked him with genuine warmth and noted, as Bellini withdrew, that the man's eyes had moved once, briefly, involuntarily, to the writing table in the corner before he left. The table held nothing of interest. Poirot had placed nothing on it yet. The glance, therefore, was not curiosity about what was there. It was the glance of a man confirming that something was not there. He filed this observation in the appropriate place and set about arranging the room. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the writing table held a map of the Italian Riviera coastline with 3 towns circled in Poirot's immaculate hand. Marseille, though technically across the border, it fell within the relevant geography, Genoa and San Aurelio. Beside the map lay a sheet of cream paper on which he had written a column of dates and a column of events, connected by lines that were beginning, very tentatively, to form a shape. Inspector Ventresca arrived at 4:30, as requested. He looked at the table with the expression of a man who has walked into a room and found it subtly rearranged. "Sit down, Inspector," said Poirot. "I have been making enquiries by telephone this morning, with the kind assistance of your constable, who is a young man of considerable patience and a commendably clear-speaking voice." Ventresca sat. "What enquiries?" 6 weeks ago in Marseille, a guest at the Hotel Méditerranée vanished. Poirot touched the first circle on the map. His room was found in order. His luggage remained. On the nightstand, a white camellia, fresh and, according to the chambermaid who found it, cut very cleanly at the stem. He moved his finger to the second circle. 3 weeks ago in Genoa, a man was found drowned in the harbour. He had been identified as a biochemist formerly employed by a company registered under the name Veritas Laboratories. On the pier beside him, "You anticipate me." "A camellia," said Ventresca. "A camellia," Poirot confirmed. He did not sit. He stood at the table with his hands clasped behind his back, in the manner of a lecturer who has not yet reached the portion of his address that will disturb his audience. "The man in Marseille has not been found. The man in Genoa was ruled an accidental drowning, pending further enquiry. In both cases, the investigating authorities noted the flower and attached no significance to it. It is not, after all, an inherently sinister object. But you attach significance to it. I attach significance to the pattern." Poirot turned from the table. 3 towns, 3 incidents, each separated by approximately 3 weeks, each involving a person connected, however tangentially, and to the pharmaceutical industry. He paused. And each preceded by the arrival, in that town, of a woman suffering from episodic memory loss, who had formerly worked for Veritas Laboratories. Ventresca was very still. Lydia Gray was in Marseille. She was, and in Genoa, Her hotel receipts, which her handbag was good enough to supply this morning while she slept, confirm both. Poirot's voice was measured, but beneath it ran something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite unease. The particular quality of a mind that has found the shape of a thing and does not yet know whether to be pleased or alarmed. She does not remember either visit. She told me she came to San Aurelio because a letter instructed her to do so. I think it probable that similar letters preceded her arrivals in Marseille and Genoa. "Someone has been moving her," said Ventresca slowly. Someone has been moving her," Poirot agreed. "As one moves a piece on a board, not carelessly, very carefully indeed, keeping her in proximity to these events without allowing her to understand that she is in proximity to them." He returned to the table and picked up the second sheet of paper, which he handed to Ventresca. This arrived at the hotel desk at midday, addressed to her. The concierge, to his credit, you thought it sufficiently unusual to bring to my attention before delivering it. It was a hotel brochure, the folded, illustrated variety distributed freely at tourist offices and ferry terminals along the Riviera. 3 hotels were circled in blue ink, one in Marseille, one in Genoa, one in San Aurelio. Through the first 2 circles a single line had been drawn. The third remained unmarked, but beside it, in the same blue ink, a date had been written. Tomorrow's date. Ventresca looked up from the brochure. "This is addressed to her," he said. "Someone wants her to know." "Someone wants her to feel the imminence of it," said Poirot. "There is a distinction." He took the brochure back and studied it for a moment. "This is not a warning sent by a friend. A friend would say, 'Leave San Aurelio.' This says only, 'You are next, and you are already here, and the date is tomorrow.'" He set it down with a care that bordered on deliberateness. "It is sent by someone who wishes her to be afraid, who wishes perhaps for the state of fear to produce something, a response, an action, a memory surfacing under pressure. Or it is sent to provoke her into running," said Ventresca, with the practical instinct of his profession, "and to flush out whoever may be protecting her." Poirot looked at him with an expression of genuine approval. "You reason well, Inspector. Yes, that possibility also exists." He moved to the window and stood for a moment, looking down at the lemon tree in the courtyard. Its leaves were very green, very still in the afternoon heat. Which is why Mademoiselle Gray will not receive this brochure this evening. She will receive it tomorrow morning at a time and in a manner of our choosing, with you or one of your men within reach. And in the meantime— "In the meantime," said Poirot, turning from the window, "I intend to have a conversation I should have had yesterday." He found Dr. Sophia Marin on the hotel terrace at 5 o'clock, with a glass of mineral water and a medical journal open on the table before her. She did not close the journal when he approached, which told him something. She looked up from it with the expression of a woman who has been aware of his approach for some time and has decided, on balance, to appear otherwise. "Dr. Marin," said Poirot pleasantly, always sitting down without invitation, "I wonder if I might ask you a professional question." "If you like." Her voice was precise, slightly accented, and entirely without warmth. Not hostile, merely absent of the social lubricant that most people applied automatically. She was a woman, Poirot judged, who had long since decided that warmth was inefficient. Camellia oil, said Poirot. I understand it has applications in neurological research. You are a neurologist, I believe. A pause. Fractional. But there. It has been investigated, she said carefully, in the context of certain experimental treatments. The fatty acid profile is of some theoretical interest. It is not in clinical use. Theoretical interest, Poirot repeated. Forgive me. In what area of neurology, specifically? Her eyes met his with the steady, assessing quality of someone taking a measurement. Memory consolidation, she said, or among other things. Poirot smiled at her with great cordiality and thanked her for her time. He walked back through the hotel with his hands clasped behind his back and his brows drawn very slightly together. Not in confusion, but in the focused attention of a man whose little grey cells have just received information they consider important. Camellia oil, memory consolidation, Veritas Laboratories. He paused in the corridor outside his sitting room, one hand on the door. The shape on the paper was no longer tentative. It had edges now, and a centre. And at the centre something that had not yet fully revealed itself, but would, he was now quite certain, do so very soon. Whether he would be in time to prevent it was a separate question entirely. Chapter 5. The Pursuit and the Maze. Wednesday began with a question about camellias. Poirot posed it to 3 people before breakfast, with the apologetic air of a man making a harmless inquiry, and received 3 answers of varying interest. The first was from Elena Rossi, the flower seller's daughter, whom he encountered at the harbour market shortly after 7. She was a child of perhaps 10, with watchful dark eyes, and the self-possessed manner of someone accustomed to being underestimated by adults. Poirot admired this quality. He shared it. White camellias, he said, examining a bunch of carnations with apparent absorption. Or one does not see them often here. No, said Elena. She was watching him with the frank appraisal of childhood. They don't grow on the hillside. Someone would have to bring them. From where, do you think? She considered this with genuine seriousness. There is a garden at the Villa Aldabrini, above the eastern cliff. They have camellias there, white ones. She paused. But the villa is empty, has been for 2 years. The second answer came from the hotel concierge, who confirmed, each with the thoroughness of a man who notices everything and discusses it with great pleasure, that no florist in San Aurelio stocked white camellias. He had not been asked to procure any for the hotel's current guests. He had not seen any in the market. He had, however, seen a woman, he described Dr. Marin with unconscious accuracy, walking on the eastern cliff road on Sunday evening, which was, Poirot noted, the evening before Lydia Gray had been found at the lighthouse stairs. The third answer was from Adrian Vale. Vale had not answered the question directly because Poirot had not posed it to him directly. Instead, Poirot had encountered him in the hotel corridor after breakfast and remarked, in the musing tone of a man thinking aloud, that the courtyard's lemon tree would benefit from a companion planting, and that he had always found camellia particularly suited to Mediterranean courtyards. Japonica, perhaps, or the white sinensis variety. And Vale had said, I shouldn't think you'd find the sinensis variety at this altitude, and then stopped, as a man stops when he has answered a question he did not know he was being asked. You are a botanist as well as an art dealer, Mr. Vale, said Poirot pleasantly. I notice things, said Vale after a moment. As do I, said Poirot. It is a useful habit in both our professions. They regarded each other for a moment in the narrow corridor with the mutual assessment of two chess players examining the same board from opposite sides. Vale's eyes were pale grey, sharp, and, this was the thing that interested Poirot, not unfriendly. There was no hostility in him, no evasion of the obvious kind. He was a man with a secret, certainly. But the secret, Poirot suspected, was not of the variety that required concealment from Poirot specifically. He filed this assessment beside the other and went to collect his hat. The Eastern Cliff Road was 40 minutes' walk from the harbour, following a path that climbed through terraces of olive and citrus before emerging onto open limestone where the wind came in hard off the sea. The Villa Aldobrini stood at the path's highest point. A substantial stone house with shuttered windows and a garden wall over which, invisible even from the road, the unpruned branches of several large shrubs extended into the salt air. Among them, unmistakably, a camellia, white-flowered, overgrown, and recently disturbed. Several branches had been cut within the past week. The cuts were clean. The gate was padlocked, but the padlock, on examination, was new. Poirot did not attempt the gate. He stood for some time looking at the upper windows of the house. One shutter on the first floor, he observed, was not fully latched. It moved in the wind with a small, periodic creak. The others were still. He was considering the implications of this when footsteps on the cliff path resolved themselves into Inspector Ventresca, accompanied by a younger constable of impressive build and a somewhat apprehensive expression. "I had a feeling," said Ventresca, with the resignation of a man whose feelings have proved inconveniently accurate, "that you would be here. The villa is empty, you said." "Since the Aldobrini family sold it 2 years ago. There is a purchasing company, registered in Geneva. We have not been able to reach them." "A purchasing company registered in Geneva," Poirot repeated thoughtfully, "which purchased a property with a garden containing white camellias on the eastern cliff above San Aurelio, and has taken no steps to occupy, renovate, or let it." He looked at the new padlock. "Until recently." Ventresca followed his gaze. A brief silence. "I can obtain a warrant," said Ventresca, "by this afternoon." "Do so," said Poirot. "I think you will find the interior informative." He did not wait for the warrant. He returned to the hotel, collected his stick, and called upon Lydia Gray. She was dressed and sitting at her window, her bandaged ankle extended before her, looking out at the harbour with an expression of concentrated effort that suggested she had been attempting, again, to recover something from the fog of her own past. She looked up when he entered and reached immediately for the envelope on her bedside table. "It came this morning," she said, "with my breakfast tray. The concierge said you had left instructions." A slight note of question in her voice, which she suppressed. She was not a woman who asked for explanation when she could instead observe its absence. "I did," said Poirot. "And you have looked at the contents?" "Yes." She held the brochure in her lap with both hands, studying it as one studies a document in an unfamiliar language, seeking not vocabulary but structure. "Marseille, Genoa, San Aurelio." Her voice was level. "And tomorrow's date." "What do you feel," said Poirot, "when you look at it?" It was not the question she had expected. She glanced at him, and then back at the brochure, and took the inquiry with the seriousness it deserved. "Something like recognition," she said at last. "Not of the places exactly, of the shape of it, and as though I have looked at a sequence like this before." She set the brochure down. "Is that useful to you?" "Everything is useful to me," said Poirot. "Tell me about Veritas Laboratories." The reaction was subtle but legible to a practiced eye, a slight quickening of attention, a momentary tension in the hands. She did not flinch. She thought. "I worked there for 3 years," she said slowly, "in a regulatory capacity. Compliance, oversight, documentation of trial protocols." She paused. I left. I had concerns about certain trials, neurological research. The protocols were not—" She stopped again, and this time the pause was different. Not the pause of a woman searching her memory, but of a woman who has found something in it and is uncertain whether to continue. "The protocols were not ethical," said Poirot quietly. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, "I made a report to the relevant authorities." Her voice had flattened, or as voices do when recounting events that were once charged with feeling and have since been compressed by time into something harder. "Shortly after that, I began to lose days." The harbour bell rang the hour below them. A fishing boat moved across the window's rectangle of blue. "Mademoiselle Gray," said Poirot, "the knowledge you reported, the details of those trials. Is it possible that your report was incomplete, that there was something you knew or had seen that did not make it into the document?" Her brow furrowed. "I don't know," she said. "I have wondered. A beat. I used to wonder before I stopped being able to trust my own wondering." Poirot rose. At the door he paused, as had become something of a habit in this investigation, and turned back. "You are not to leave this room this evening," he said. "Not for any reason. If someone brings you a message suggesting a meeting, a letter asking you to come somewhere, you will send word to me immediately." She regarded him steadily. "You are expecting something to happen." "I am expecting someone to attempt something," Poirot said. "There is a distinction. What is attempted may be prevented. What happens has already happened." He offered her a small, precise nod. "Bonne nuit, mademoiselle, or rather, bonne soirée. The night has not yet begun." He left the hotel and walked quickly toward the Eastern Cliff Road. What the warrant, he trusted, would be ready. There was a wall covered in photographs waiting for him inside the Villa Aldobrini. Though he did not yet know this, he knew only that the camellia branches had been cut within the week, that a shutter on the first floor moved in the wind, and that a company registered in Geneva had purchased a property it had no apparent use for, and fitted it with a new padlock 2 days after Lydia Gray arrived in San Aurelio. The little grey cells, as he was fond of remarking, required order and method. At this particular moment they were insisting with considerable urgency on haste. Chapter 6. The Wrong Door. The warrant arrived at 3:30. Ventresca presented it with the brisk satisfaction of a man who has navigated bureaucracy at speed and considers this an achievement worth acknowledging. The constable of impressive build, whose name Poirot had established, Ewers Ferretti, stood at the gate of the Villa Aldobrini with a pair of bolt cutters and an air of professional readiness. The new padlock gave way without ceremony. The garden inside was the garden of a house that had been neglected for 2 years, and then, recently and partially attended to. The paths were overgrown, the beds untended, the ornamental fountain dry and furred with lichen. But the camellia bushes along the east wall had been pruned, clumsily, by someone who knew what they wanted and not much more. And beneath them the clipped stems lay in the grass like discarded evidence, which, Poirot reflected, was precisely what they were. The house itself smelled of dust and salt air, and something else beneath both. A faint chemical sharpness that did not belong to an empty building. Antiseptic of some kind, or something related to it. Poirot paused in the entrance hall, lifted his head slightly, and said nothing. Ventresca noticed the pause. He had developed, over the past 2 days, a sharp attentiveness to Poirot's pauses. "Upstairs," said Poirot. The staircase was stone, its banister filmed with dust undisturbed except for one section, the middle portion, where a hand had rested and the dust had been wiped clean in a long, continuous stroke. Someone had climbed these stairs in the dark, Poirot inferred, feeling their way by touch rather than sight. The upper corridor held 4 doors, for 3 were locked. The 4th, the room with the unlatched shutter, stood open. Poirot entered first. The room had been a study in the house's occupied life. The desk remained, and 2 chairs and a set of empty shelves along one wall from which the books had long since been removed. What covered the opposite wall was not furniture. It was photographs. Perhaps 60 of them, fixed to the plaster with small brass pins, arranged in rows with a regularity that was itself a kind of statement. But they showed Lydia Gray, not posed, not aware, caught in the candid anonymity of a subject under observation. Lydia at a cafe table, reading. Lydia crossing a street in what appeared to be Paris or perhaps Lyon. Lydia at a conference registration desk, a lanyard around her neck, a folder under her arm. Lydia at a harbour, Genoa's harbour. Poirot recognized the waterfront, looking out at the water with an expression he now knew well, the focused blankness of a person trying to remember. Ventresca stood in the doorway and was quiet for rather a long time. "Years," he said at last. The single word carried the weight of the obvious conclusion. "Years," Poirot agreed. He moved along the wall slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, reading the photographs as one reads a document. The images were dated in soft pencil on their lower right corners. The earliest he found after a methodical search was 4 years ago. The most recent was 6 days ago. It showed Lydia Gray seated at a cafe table in San Aurelio's harbour market. Across the table from her, just entering the frame at its left edge, was the sleeve of a cream linen jacket. Poirot examined this detail for some moments without expression. Then he turned to the desk. It was empty. The drawers had been cleared, not hastily, but thoroughly, in the manner of someone who had prepared for this discovery. The surface held only a single object, they placed with the deliberateness that was becoming a signature. A white camellia, freshly cut, its stem trimmed at the familiar angle, placed since yesterday evening. The petals had not yet begun to turn. "Someone knew we would come here," said Ventresca. "Someone arranged for us to come here," said Poirot. He said it without heat, but something had tightened in his expression. The particular quality of a man who has been manoeuvred and knows it, and is evaluating the implications with cold precision. The shutter left open, the new padlock, conspicuous enough to invite a warrant, not strong enough to resist one. the photographs arranged for maximum effect. He looked again at the wall. This room was prepared for our arrival. To what end? Poirot turned from the photographs. To direct our attention toward a long and calculated surveillance of Mademoiselle Gray. To suggest obsession, fixation, the pathology of a particular kind of criminal mind. He paused. And most importantly, to occupy our afternoon. Ventresca's eyes narrowed. While something else is arranged elsewhere. Yes. Poirot was already at the door. We must go back. They came down the cliff road at a pace that was not quite running, but departed from Poirot's customary dignity to a degree that would have surprised those who knew him. Ferretti preceded them at an actual run. He dispatched by Ventresca with instructions to reach the hotel by the lower path, and confirmed that Lydia Gray was in her room. He met them at the harbour front with the confirmation they did not want. She was not in her room. She had been seen by the kitchen boy, crossing the harbour square at approximately 3:15, some 45 minutes ago, in the direction of the lighthouse. She had been alone. She had appeared, the kitchen boy offered helpfully, to be walking with purpose. Poirot closed his eyes for precisely 2 seconds. She received a message, he said, not a question. Ferretti, consulting a folded note he had collected from her room, left on her windowsill, it says, he read with the effortful care of a man for whom French is third language. The answer is at the lighthouse. Come at 3. Come alone. Do not tell Poirot. He is not what he appears. A silence fell over the 3 men on the harbour front. Around them, San Aurelio continued its late afternoon commerce entirely undisturbed. Remarkably direct, said Ventresca, with dry understatement. Remarkably effective, said Poirot, which was a different observation. He was already moving toward the lighthouse road. She came, despite everything I told her. Despite knowing, he stopped. Despite knowing you had warned her, Ventresca said, falling into step. No. Poirot's voice was quiet. Despite knowing she should not trust her own judgment, she came because the note said the answer was there. The one thing she wants beyond any other consideration, the thing she has been chasing across 3 countries and cannot recover by any act of will, is her own memory. He paused at the foot of the harbour steps. Whoever wrote that note understands her completely. The lighthouse road was empty. The lighthouse itself stood above the cliff in the long gold light of late afternoon, its lamp dark at this hour, its white tower serenely indifferent. The stone staircase where Lydia had been found 2 mornings ago descended beside it to the water. At the bottom of those stairs, in the deepening shadow, Poirot found a single white camellia on the step. Not placed this time. Dropped, as though released from a hand in motion. Beyond the staircase, a door in the lighthouse base stood open. From inside came the sound, low and insistent, of a motorcar engine idling somewhere on the road above. And then, and abruptly, silence. Ventresca and Ferretti went through the door first. Poirot stood for a moment on the step, looking at the dropped camellia. The difference between placed and dropped was not a small one. Placed was theatre. Dropped was accident or haste or something that had not gone according to plan. He looked up at the open door and then at the road above, and then at the sea, which was turning copper in the evening light, and had nothing whatever to say on the matter. And then he went inside. Chapter 7. The Second Strike. The ground floor of the lighthouse was a single circular room that smelled of oil and stone and the particular damp that comes from decades of proximity to the sea. A metal staircase wound upward through its centre to the lamp room above. The walls were bare except for a rusted bracket and a faded notice in Italian concerning the operation of the fog signal. A Lydia Gray sat on the lowest step of the metal staircase with her back very straight and her hands in her lap, and the expression of a woman who has made an error of considerable magnitude and is neither excusing it nor indulging it. She was unharmed. Ferretti stood near the door. Ventresca moved through the room in a swift, professional circuit, confirmed it held nothing further of interest, and came to rest near the staircase, with the contained manner of a man reserving his questions. Poirot entered last and closed the door behind him. "You came," he said to Lydia. It was not a reproach. It was an observation made in the same tone one might note the weather. "I came," she said. She did not look away. There was a note. It said, "I have read the note." Poirot moved to the centre of the room and stood with his stick held loosely before him. "You arrived at 3 o'clock. What did you find?" "Nothing. The door was open. I waited." She glanced toward the high, on salt-crusted window. For perhaps 20 minutes, no one came. A pause. Then I heard the car on the road above, an engine running, then stopping. Then your men came through the door. She looked at him with the level gaze he had come to associate with her moments of most uncomfortable honesty. "I was used, wasn't I, to empty the room at the villa?" "You were," said Poirot, "and I was careless. I told you not to leave this room, and I did not tell you why, not with sufficient specificity. And so when an offer was made that the reason could not outweigh, you made the only calculation available to you." He considered her for a moment. "That is not a reproach, mademoiselle. It is an admission." Something in her face shifted very slightly, not softened exactly, but recalibrated. She nodded once. "There is, however, something I must ask you immediately." Poirot drew one of the wooden chairs that stood against the wall into the centre of the room and sat down, bringing himself to her level with the deliberateness of a man who understands the geometry of conversation. "When you entered this lighthouse and found it empty in those 20 minutes of waiting, did anything occur to you? Any image, any word, any fragment, however small, that felt as though it did not belong to this afternoon?" She was quiet for long enough that Ventresca shifted his weight. "A name," she said at last. "Tell me." "Helix." She said it carefully, as one repeats a word heard once in a foreign language. "I don't know what it means. It came when I was sitting here in the smell of the place, the oil, and the salt." She looked at the walls. "I think I have smelled this combination before, in a laboratory, a particular kind of laboratory." "Helix," Poirot repeated. He did not write it down. He committed it, as he committed everything, to the immaculate filing system within. "You have not remembered this word before today?" "No." Poirot rose, replaced the chair against the wall with characteristic precision, and turned to Ventresca. "The car on the road above, I want the road examined. Tire marks if there are any. The road above this lighthouse connects to the coast road, which connects in turn to the road that passes the Villa Aldabrini." He paused. "It is a short drive between the two, for a person who knew we would go to the villa and knew approximately how long we would remain." Ventresca issued the instruction to Ferretti without inflection. Ferretti departed. The walk back to the hotel was conducted largely in silence. Lydia moved slowly on account of her bandaged ankle, and Poirot matched her pace without comment. The sun was low now, throwing long orange shadows across the cobblestones and turning the harbour to hammered bronze. The fishing boats were coming in. The evening was beginning its familiar transformation of San Aurelio from a place of industry into a place of pleasure, and the town was submitting to the change with its customary grace. At the harbour square, 3 things happened in rapid and unsettling succession. The first, Marco Bellini emerged from the Albergo's street entrance, saw them approaching, and produced his customary expression of welcoming concern. He asked after Mademoiselle Gray's health with every appearance of sincerity. He offered to arrange a dinner tray. He expressed with great feeling his distress that a guest of his establishment had been subjected to anxiety and inconvenience. Throughout this performance, and Poirot watched it with the attention he might give a piece of music he suspected of being in the wrong key. His eyes moved to Lydia's face precisely 4 times, and to Poirot's precisely none. A man who is guilty of something looks at the detective to measure how much is known. A man who is afraid of something looks at the person he is afraid for. Marco Bellini, it appeared, was afraid of something. This was, in its way, more interesting than guilt. The second, Poirot's eye fell upon Adrian Vale, seated at a corner table in the hotel's open-fronted bar with a glass of wine and the 3-day-old newspaper, which he appeared to have retrieved from wherever he had been keeping it. Vale looked up, met Poirot's gaze across the square, and performed the unremarkable small nod of a man with nothing to communicate. Poirot returned the nod and smiled. Vale's eyes moved briefly and involuntarily toward the eastern cliff road, and the direction of the Villa Aldobrini, before he looked away. A man who has nothing to communicate does not betray by a glance of 4 seconds that he has lately been thinking about a specific location. Vale had been thinking about the villa. He had been thinking about it for long enough that the direction of it had become, for the moment, a reflex. This was the second thing. The third came as they reached the hotel entrance. Ferretti, returning from the lighthouse road at a pace that indicated news, appeared at the end of the harbour front and crossed toward them at a near run. He had found the tyre marks. He had found rather more than tyre marks. On the verge above the lighthouse in the long grass beside the road, he had found a syringe, capped but not sealed, empty, and beside it, caught on the grass stem with the randomness of something dropped rather than placed, a second white camellia. Stem uncut this time, and broken, roughly, from a living branch. Ventresca looked at the capped syringe in the evidence bag Ferretti produced, and then looked at Poirot. The villa was not the only place they had been this afternoon, he said. No, said Poirot, but the villa was the place they wished us to think they had been. He considered the syringe for a moment. The lighthouse was the real appointment. The question is whether Mademoiselle Gray was early enough to disrupt it, or whether she arrived after the person above had already confirmed what they came to confirm. Confirmed what? That she came, said Poirot quietly, when summoned, that the mechanism still works. He handed the evidence bag back to Ferretti, and looked out at the harbour where the last fishing boat was easing into its berth with the unhurried competence of long practice. Someone needed to know that Lydia Gray will still go where she is told to go, even against all instruction and better judgment. He was silent for a moment. "They are not improvising now," he said. "They are confirming their preparations, which means the final act is closer than tomorrow." He walked into the hotel, exchanged his stick for a fresh sheet of cream notepaper, and sat down at the table in the small sitting room. He wrote one word at the top of the page: helix. Beneath it, after a long pause, he wrote a second: tonight. He looked at the two words for some time. Then he began to plan. Chapter 8. The Trap Within the Trap. At 9 o'clock that evening, Poirot requested, through Ventresca, the attendance of Adrian Vale in the small sitting room. Vale arrived punctually and without visible apprehension, which was itself a form of information. He sat in the chair Poirot indicated, crossed one leg over the other, and looked at Poirot with the composed attentiveness of a man who has been waiting for a particular conversation and has decided to receive it with good grace. Poirot dispensed with preamble. "You are not an art dealer," he said. Vale considered this for a moment with the expression of someone examining a statement for its precise degree of accuracy. "I have on occasion purchased art," he said. "It would be more correct to say I am not only an art dealer." "You are attached to an organization with an interest in the activities of Veritas Laboratories," said Poirot. "You arrived in San Aurelio before Lydia Gray, which means you were not following her. You were preceding her. You knew she was coming." He paused. "You have been watching over her, Mr. Vale. Not watching her, as someone else has been doing for 4 years. Watching over her. There is, as I have had occasion to remark recently, a considerable difference." A silence of some length. "British intelligence," said Vale at last, in the tone of a man making a concession that has, strictly speaking, already been made for him. "A department with an interest in pharmaceutical research of an irregular nature. Veritas Laboratories has been under observation for 3 years. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward slightly. "Lydia Gray filed a report 18 months ago. The report was credible, specific, and extraordinarily dangerous to a number of people. 2 weeks after she filed it, her memory began to deteriorate." His voice was even, but something ran beneath it. "We do not consider that a coincidence." "Nor do I," said Poirot. "The question I find more pressing is why, having identified the danger, your organization placed one man with a 3-day-old newspaper in San Aurelio, rather than removing Mademoiselle Gray from it entirely." Vale met this without flinching. She wouldn't go. She was told in terms that left no room for misunderstanding that she was in danger and should leave. She refused. A brief pause. She said she would not spend the rest of her life running from something she couldn't remember. She said San Aurelio was the first place that had felt, in 18 months, then as though it might contain an answer. Poirot was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the harbour made its gentle nocturnal sounds. Water, rope, the distant speech of fishermen. "And the letter directing her here," he said. "The letter that told her the truth she had forgotten was waiting in San Aurelio." "Not ours," said Vale flatly. "We have been trying to establish who sent it since she arrived." He looked at Poirot steadily. That is rather why I was hoping you were as good as your reputation. Poirot received this with appropriate modesty and redirected his attention. Helix, he said. Project Helix. Tell me what you know. Vale's expression altered very slightly. A fractional tightening that told Poirot the word had landed with some weight. Where did you hear that? From Mademoiselle Gray, under circumstances that suggest it emerged not from deliberate memory, but from involuntary association. Sensory stimulus, specifically. It is, I believe, the name she could not recover by any act of conscious effort, because it is precisely this name that was targeted for erasure. Vale was silent for long enough that Ventresca, standing by the door, shifted almost imperceptibly. Project Helix was Veritas's primary research program, Vale said at last. Than 3 years of illegal neurological trials, subjects recruited without informed consent, many of them presenting with early-stage memory disorders. The premise was that specific memory clusters could be selectively suppressed or stimulated using a compound derived from, among other things, camellia oil as a carrier agent. He stopped. The research was extraordinary, the method was unconscionable, and the lead scientist was Dr. Sophia Marin, said Poirot. Vale looked at him. You knew? I suspected. Now I know. Poirot rose and moved to the window with the quiet purposefulness of a man whose thinking has caught up with his instinct. Marin lost everything when the program was shut down. Her career, her data, her life's work. She blamed Gray's report. He turned. But the report was incomplete, you said. There was something Lydia knew, something she had witnessed or documented, that did not make it into her testimony, something that would be, to Dr. Marin, either a threat or a necessity. The compound formula, said Vale. The final synthesis. Lydia Gray was present when it was completed. She documented it. That documentation was never recovered. He met Poirot's gaze. Marin doesn't want to punish her, Monsieur Poirot. She wants what's inside her head. The room was very still. In the clarity that followed, the architecture of the entire investigation rearranged itself with the silent, definitive logic of tumblers falling in a lock on the camellias. Not a signature, not a threat, but a pharmacological marker. Camellia oil left at each site where Marin had brought her compound to bear. The attacks on Lydia, not attempts to kill, but calibrated stresses applied to a mind under observation, each one designed to measure what pressure produced, what response. The photographs at the villa, exactly what he had said. Bait staged for discovery. I intended to frame the investigation around obsession and predation rather than science and theft. Even the letter summoning Lydia to San Aurelio. Not from Marin, but from someone else. Someone who had their own reasons for wanting Lydia Gray in this particular place, at this particular time. This last thought gave Poirot a moment's pause. He filed it, precisely, and continued. Marin will make her final attempt tonight or tomorrow, he said. She has confirmed that Lydia responds to summons, and that the mechanism of suggestion still functions, and that the compound she carries is sufficient for the procedure. He looked at Vale. She will want controlled conditions, quiet, time, a location she knows. He paused. The lighthouse. The lighthouse laboratory, Vale said quietly. Yes. We believe she has been using the lower level. There is a second room beneath the base, accessible from the seaward side. Old storage, from the lighthouse authorities' records, not visible from the road. "You knew this," said Ventresca, with a flatness that contained considerable temperature. "We suspected it this afternoon. By the time we were certain, Ferretti had already found the syringe, and Monsieur Poirot was already—" Vale glanced at him, clearly several steps ahead of the available evidence. Poirot did not confirm or deny this. "Here is what will happen," he said. He moved back to the table and stood before his map with his hands clasped, or in the manner of a man who has given his grey cells their instructions and is now conveying them to the relevant parties. "Tomorrow morning, Lydia Gray will receive a message. It will appear to come from me. It will ask her to come to the lighthouse at 11 o'clock, and it will explain, briefly but convincingly, that I have discovered the answer to what she has forgotten, and wish to tell her there, away from the hotel." He met both men's eyes in turn. "Marin will intercept this message. I will ensure she does. She will understand that I have not yet located her, and that Lydia will arrive at the lighthouse alone. She will prepare her equipment." He paused. "And I will already be there." "And if Marin begins before you can intervene," said Ventresca. The question sat in the room with some weight. "That," said Poirot, "is the risk." He said it without evasion and without particular drama. "It is the risk I'm choosing to take rather than the risk of warning Marin off without securing the evidence, without recovering the formula documentation, and without accounting for the 2 deaths in Marseille and Genoa that have thus far been treated as accidents." He looked at the window, at the dark harbour beyond. "There is also the matter of Marin's assistants." "You believe she has accomplices inside the hotel," said Vale. "I believe she has one," said Poirot. "And I have believed so since the second morning, when I observed a man ensuring that his guests did not notice things they ought to have noticed." He straightened his cuffs with a precise, familiar gesture. "Marco Bellini will be in his office at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I shall visit him at 5 minutes past. By 9 o'clock, we will know rather more than we do now." He surveyed the map for a final moment, then folded it with careful hands. "And the little grey cells," he remarked to no one in particular, "have been working at some considerable cost to the holiday." Neither Vale nor Ventresca appeared to find this an appropriate moment for levity. Poirot considered this and decided he did not disagree with them. Chapter 9. Checkmate. Marco Bellini was a man who had built his life on the reliable principle that charm, properly maintained, was indistinguishable from innocence. He was behind his office desk at 5 minutes past 8, with a cup of coffee and a ledger open before him, and he received Poirot with the professional warmth of a host who considers no hour too early for hospitality. He offered coffee. He expressed again his distress at recent events. He smoothed the surface of the conversation with the unconscious expertise of long practice. Poirot sat down, accepted nothing, and said, "The message you delivered to Mademoiselle Gray on Tuesday evening. The one left on her windowsill. Who gave it to you?" The coffee cup descended to its saucer with great care. "I don't know what you passed her room at 20 minutes past 2 on Wednesday afternoon," said Poirot. "The kitchen boy saw you on the stairs. You were not carrying anything when you went up. You were carrying a folded paper when you came down." He watched Bellini with the patience of a man who has already arrived at his destination and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. "I do not think you composed that message, Mr. Bellini. I do not think you are a cruel man. I think you are a frightened one, which is a considerably more common condition and, in the circumstances, a more forgivable one. Bellini looked at his ledger. A muscle moved in his jaw. She told me it was a kindness, he said at last, that the woman needed to know something and it would help her. He did not look up. She told me this 2 weeks ago when she first arrived. She said there was a woman coming to San Aurelio who had been unwell, who had suffered, and that she, Dr. Marin, was trying to help her recover something she had lost. She asked only that I facilitate certain small communications. Nothing harmful, nothing illegal. He paused. She is a doctor. Yeah, she was very convincing. She generally is, said Poirot. What else did you facilitate? A longer pause. I told her when Mademoiselle Gray left the hotel, where she went, when she returned. He put his hands flat on the desk. When I understood what had happened at the lighthouse stairs, that the fall was not an accident, I wanted to go to Inspector Ventresca. But she had told me things about herself, about what she had lost when her work was taken from her, about what she was trying to recover. He lifted his eyes finally, and what was in them was neither dishonesty nor comfort. I believed she was telling the truth about that, at least. She was, said Poirot quietly. He rose. You will come to the inspector's office at 9 o'clock and tell him everything you have told me. This is not a request. Bellini nodded once, with the relief of a man who has been waiting for someone to take a decision from him. Because the lower level of the lighthouse was reached, as Vale had indicated, through a seaward door cut into the base of the tower, and accessible from the narrow ledge of rock that ran between the cliff face and the water. Poirot reached it at 9:30, having descended the lighthouse stairs from above, and found, behind a panel in the storage alcove that smelled of oil and old rope, a second door that was neither old nor rusted. Beyond it was a room of approximately 12 feet square. It held a folding table, 2 chairs, a lamp running from a portable battery, and on the table a case of instruments that Poirot examined with care and considerable distaste. Several syringes, 3 glass vials of a colourless compound, a monitoring device of the kind used to measure neurological responses, a recorder. Beside the case, a manila folder containing printed pages, dense with notation, formulae, trial data, and at its front a title page. Project Helix, Synthesis Protocol, your final revision. Poirot left everything precisely as he found it. He was back upstairs and standing in the lamp room with its unimpeded view of the lighthouse road, the harbour, and the coastal path, when Ventresca arrived at 10 o'clock with 2 constables and Adrian Vale. "Bellini," said Ventresca. "At your office. He will be cooperative." Poirot turned from the window. "The room below is prepared and waiting, and I have sent word to Mademoiselle Gray through the hotel. She has been told to come at 11 in my name, and that I have found the answer she has been seeking." He paused. "Now we wait, which I have always found the most technically demanding part of any investigation." Dr. Sophia Marin arrived at 18 minutes past 10. She came along the coastal path from the east, from the direction of the Villa Aldobrini, which confirmed a supposition or two, carrying a leather bag and moving with the unhurried purpose of a person who believes themselves unobserved. She was dressed plainly, dark trousers, a grey jacket, flat shoes suited to cliff paths. She carried no camellia. There was nothing theatrical about her this morning. The performance, it seemed, was over. Poirot came down the stairs alone and entered the lower room as she was setting out the instruments. She heard him and turned. Yet for one moment her expression held something raw and unguarded. Not fear, but something more complicated. Then it resolved into the same composed steadiness he had observed on the hotel terrace, and she looked at him across the folding table with the air of a woman revising, rapidly and with professional efficiency, her immediate plans. "You always arrive exactly one move too late, Monsieur Poirot," she said. Poirot shook his head. "No, Madame." He stepped into the room and gestured toward the instruments laid out on the table. "You required the subject conscious. You required her to speak, to produce, under the stimulus of the compound, and this room, and the particular quality of the light and the smell of it, the information she has been unable to access by any other means. You required time in which to record and document what she said." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded paper, which he set on the table beside the folder. It was a copy, made by Ventresca's constable that morning, of the front page of the synthesis protocol. "You also required this, and we have had it since 9 o'clock. Her gaze went to the paper, then back to him. "The formula was transmitted to the relevant authorities in Rome and London at 9:30 this morning," said Poirot. "Along with the supporting documentation from the cases in Marseille and Genoa, the compound and instruments from this room, as catalogued an hour ago, and a full statement from Mr. Marco Bellini." He paused. "The experiment is over, Dr. Marin. Not because I have outmaneuvered you, though I have, but because Mademoiselle Gray remembered the word helix yesterday afternoon in this lighthouse, under conditions of sensory association that you yourself created across 3 cities and 2 months. The mechanism you built to extract her memory functioned in the end against you." Marin looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the sea moved against the rock with its long, indifferent rhythm. Somewhere above them, Ventresca was already descending the stairs. "You're right about one thing," she said. Her voice had not changed. It had, if anything, become more precise. Stripped of the last residue of social performance, down to the material beneath. "You do understand the mind." She set down the syringe she had been holding. Poirot had not allowed himself to note that she had been holding it, and placed it on the table with the care of a surgeon returning an instrument to its tray. "If my work had succeeded," she said, "no one would ever have to forget the people they love." It was, Poirot thought, the most terrible kind of true thing. Not false, not entirely right, or carrying within it a weight of genuine grief that no verdict could reduce or resolve. He had no answer. The door opened. Ventresca entered with his constables, and the room, which had held for a few minutes the close pressurized atmosphere of a thing finally said aloud, returned to being a damp stone room beneath a lighthouse, smelling of oil and salt and the particular compound in 3 glass vials on a folding table. Dr. Sophia Marin went with the police without drama, without protest, and without looking back. She moved, Poirot observed, like a chess master who has tipped over their own king. Not in defeat, exactly, but in the acknowledgement that the game, at last, is finished. He stood alone in the room for a moment after they had gone. Then he looked at the synthesis protocol and the instruments and the 3 vials of colourless compound, and he thought, now with the honesty he applied to all things, including those he would have preferred not to think, that she had been close, that the science had been real, that the world was, in some small and irresolvable way, a more ambiguous place than the clean fact her arrest suggested. He straightened his cuffs. Then he went upstairs, into the light. Chapter 10. The World After. The formalities took 3 days. There were statements to be given, documents to be signed, telephone calls conducted between Ventresca's office and authorities in Rome, London, and Geneva, whose identities Ventresca did not inquire into too closely, and Vale did not volunteer. The lower room of the lighthouse was photographed, catalogued, and emptied by men who arrived in an unmarked car and departed with the same discretion. The Villa Aldobrini was sealed. The photographs on its study wall were removed, examined, and retained as evidence in proceedings that would unfold. Poirot understood over months and in venues considerably less picturesque than San Aurelio. Marco Bellini gave his statement in full as promised, and bore the consequences with the subdued dignity of a man who has made a poor bargain and knows it. Ventresca was not lenient, but he was not savage. Bellini had been deceived rather than corrupt, complicit rather than criminal, and the inspector drew this distinction with the precision his profession demanded and, Poirot suspected, a measure of regret that the case had required him to draw it at all. Adrian Vale departed on the morning of the 3rd day. He came to find Poirot on the hotel terrace before breakfast, which Poirot considered an imposition, but received without complaint. "The Helix documentation has been passed to a research ethics board," Vale said. He sat across the table with the economy of a man who has allotted himself 5 minutes and intends to use them efficiently. There are people, legitimate scientists working within proper protocols, who have expressed interest in the theoretical basis of Marin's work. Whether anything comes of it is not for me to say. "But something may come of it," said Poirot. "Something may." Vale looked at him steadily. "You stopped her. That was the right thing. The method was unconscionable, the victims real, the deaths unforgivable." A pause. "And the science was genuine. Both things are true." "Both things are always true," said Poirot, somewhat tiredly. "That is what makes this profession, in the long run, rather less satisfying than it appears from the outside." Vale almost smiled. He rose, offered his hand, and Poirot shook it with the sense of clasping something that would not quite identify itself. "One question," said Poirot, before Vale could move away. "The letter that brought Lydia Gray to San Aurelio. You said it was not yours." "It was not." "Have you determined whose it was?" Vale was quiet for a moment. The morning light moved across the harbour below them, turning the water from grey to green to the deep blue that preceded the full arrival of the day. "We believe," he said carefully, "that it came from one of Marin's former trial subjects, someone who knew that Lydia Gray had witnessed the synthesis. Someone who had suffered the procedure and wanted the truth about it to surface." He paused. "Someone, in other words, who decided that the best way to expose the crime was to place its most dangerous witness in proximity to its architect, and trust that Hercule Poirot happened to be on holiday in the vicinity." Poirot absorbed this. "They trusted rather a great deal to chance," he said. "They trusted rather a great deal to you," said Vale. And then he walked away down the terrace steps and did not look back, with the unhurried confidence of a man who has, on balance, achieved what he came for. Poirot sat with this information for some time until his egg arrived and demanded his attention. He visited Lydia Gray on the afternoon of the same day. She was on her own small balcony, facing the harbour, with a cup of tea grown cold on the table beside her, and the expression of a person engaged in a kind of deliberate, internal cartography. Moving through the territory of her own past and marking carefully what was present and what was not. She had, she told him, recovered certain memories over the past 2 days. Not many, and not all of them welcome, but hers. Returned to her without intervention, in the slow way that things return when the source of interference is removed. She remembered Veritas. She remembered the trials. She remembered a laboratory that smelled of antiseptic and something faintly sweet, and 2 colleagues whose faces she could now see when she closed her eyes, and a document she had printed in triplicate on a Tuesday afternoon and placed in 3 different locations because she had known, even then, that what she was doing was the kind of thing people were made to forget. The 3rd copy, she said. I remembered it last night. I posted it to my sister in Edinburgh 18 months ago in a package labelled Household Papers, because I thought, even then, before I understood what was being done to me, I thought I might need it later. Poirot nodded. He had, through Ventresca and Vale's combined connections, already ensured that Lydia's sister had been contacted and the package secured. He did not say this now. There would be time. "Will I recover the rest?" she asked. It was a direct question, I asked without performance. Dr. Ferraro believes the remaining gaps to be consistent with ordinary concussive injury, said Poirot. Some will return, some may not. He paused. I am not able to tell you otherwise. It would not be honest. She looked at him with an expression that contained something he recognized as close to gratitude, specifically of the kind that is grateful for the honesty rather than the comfort. Inspector Ventresca has suggested, she said after a moment, that I might stay in San Aurelio for a while, to complete the formal proceedings. He has been... She considered her word with the care that had become characteristic of her. Kind, in a manner that does not require anything in return. Ventresca is a good policeman, said Poirot, who occasionally requires reminding that good policemen and intuitive ones need not be in opposition. He rose. He will benefit from the reminder, I think, and from the company of someone with reason to appreciate the particular quality of his reliability. She looked at him. He had said rather more than he intended, and they both knew it, and they both chose to let it pass in a companionable silence that seemed, for a woman who had recently recovered access to her own mind, not unwelcome. Poirot descended the stairs, collected his stick, and walked out into the afternoon. San Aurelio received him with its customary indifference. The harbour glittered. The market had closed for the midday hours and was beginning its afternoon reopening with the unhurried rhythm of a place that has been doing this for several 100 years and sees no cause for urgency. The church bells spoke. The gulls replied. A cat of magnificent proportions observed Poirot from a sun-warmed wall and found him satisfactory. He walked to the café above the market and sat at the table that had, 5 days ago, been the site of an interrupted conversation he had spent the days since completing by other means. He ordered a soft-boiled egg, a coffee, and a croissant. The same waiter appeared with the same fine, dark hair and the same commendable capacity for concealment. The egg arrived properly timed. Poirot ate it with appropriate satisfaction and looked out at the harbour. He thought about memory, which was a subject he had spent more time considering this week than in the whole of the previous decade. He thought about how it was not the fixed and faithful record that one wished it to be, but something more provisional, revised by experience, vulnerable to interference, shaped as much by what one needed to have happened as by what had. He had built his career on the proposition that the truth of events could be recovered through method and order and the rigorous exercise of the grey cells. He did not abandon this proposition, but he held it this afternoon with a slightly different quality of attention than before. Truth, he reflected, was not a thing that simply existed, waiting to be found. It was a thing that had to be, at considerable effort, reconstructed. And even then it was fragmentary. Even then, some pieces did not return. He thought about Dr. Sophia Marin, who had wanted to give back to the world something that the world had not asked her for in the manner she was prepared to offer it, and who had burned through every ethical constraint in the furnace of that desire, and who had been, in her essential objective, neither entirely wrong nor remotely forgivable. He thought about a woman in a blue dress placing her hands flat on a cafe table and saying, with the particular courage of the truly frightened, "I don't know what it is." He straightened his cuffs. He drank the last of his coffee. Below him, the lighthouse stood above the sea in the afternoon light, white and silent and giving nothing away. The fishing boats drifted in the harbour. The tourists moved through the square laughing at their ease, unaware of how close the ordinary texture of the world had come to being pulled away from something beneath it. Something cold and procedural and without mercy, dressed in the grammar of care. Life, Poirot thought, was indeed a matter of precision. The difficulty was in determining at any given moment precisely what that meant. He left a coin beneath the saucer, rose, and walked slowly down the steps and into the square, where the afternoon light fell equally on everyone, and the bells rang the hour and the sea went on.